Ladies and gentlemen, it's Friday night, and I am sitting here in my hot air balloon. It looks like it's a fake backdrop. It's not a real backdrop. It looks like I'm in my den, in my manly den in my library. This is the cat. The cat. It looks like I'm in my den because of all my books behind me here. This fake book backdrop, but in fact I'm in my hot air balloon high above the rooftops of Berlin, spying on all of you, looking down with binoculars through your windows for the Chinese government. That's what I do on Friday nights. I spy on you for the Chinese government. Is it recording? We're recording. Okay, I got to tell you, I don't think the Chinese government actually takes me seriously. I send reports every week about what people are doing in Berlin, all these perverted, horrible, disgusting, inhumane things that people in Berlin are doing, that you should be ashamed of yourselves. Ashamed. You should be ashamed of yourselves. And the Chinese government, they never react. I guess they just put my videos, in the archive somewhere, and they don't care. What can I say? The Chinese government does not care about what the people of Berlin are doing on a Friday night. But I do. And I'm here on a Friday night to tell you that happiness is possible. And I learned this from Walther von der Vogelweide, who is a medieval German poet. He's dead, clearly medieval, right? So he lived in the Middle Ages. He was the premier, probably the most important German poet of the Middle Ages. But let me tell you what poet means in this regard, because poet does not always mean poet. When the nations of Europe rediscovered their medieval past in the 19th century. It was all in the 19th century. They looked back and they discovered, the Middle Ages, these guys were not as stupid as we thought they were. They were really quite smart, and they wrote, great works of art and poetry and drama and novels and verse and all that stuff. And we have to talk about this. And so, Richard Wagner rediscovers the Nibelungenlied, and writes it completely wrong and makes an opera out of it. And all this stuff. And we discover the Le Morte d'Arthur in Le Morte d'Arthur, the death of King Arthur in England. And all this happened in the 19th century. It was the rediscovery of the Middle Ages. And part of the rediscovery of the Middle Ages was Walther von der Vogelweide. That's like 5,000 words. Walther, von der Vogelweide. That's Walther of the bird meadow. Make of that what you will. And he was the premier poet of the Middle Ages, of the German Middle Ages. He wrote tons of poems, mainly love poetry, and they're all beautiful in their way, in a very medieval way. And that's the thing. The first thing we don't understand about the Middle Ages, the first thing we understand incorrectly about the Middle Ages, is that this was poetry. It was not poetry. Walther von der Vogelweide is not actually a poet. He was like Paul Simon or Bob Dylan. You can take their lyrics and you can give them a Nobel Prize for literature, and you can say that the lyrics are poetry, but in fact, they're songs. They're making songs. They're song lyrics, and there's a big difference between song lyrics and poetry. The poets of the Middle Ages, they were troubadours. They were doing their lyres, and all that stuff. Whatever it was, they were what instruments they were singing, and whatever kind of funky, weird songs they were singing. They were making music. They never wrote a poem to be read like we read them today. Poems today are written to be read, even though poets will tell you, I write. They should be spoken aloud, blah, blah, blah. But it's printed in some journal somewhere. It's written to be read. But the so-called poets of the Middle Ages, the troubadours, were actually pop singers. It was pop songs they were writing. And And you experience a song differently than you do a poem. When you read a poem, you're reading every word, and it's some kind of, you're taking meaning of it. You're concentrating on the language. When you're listening to music, you're tapping your feet. You got the rhythm. You got you've got the feel good. Your emotions are being riled up, and you're ready to dance. And then the song, the singer goes on and on. You only understand half of what he's saying, and then he hits a beat, and he rhymes something, and hits another beat, and he rhymes something. It's, oh my God! And you realize as you're dancing and you're drunk, you're drinking and drinking and listening to the bagpipes or whatever, and you realize it rhymes. Wow! It rhymes. Love rhymes with glove. There's some kind of truth in that somewhere because it rhymes. And so you're thinking you experience a song differently than you do a poem. And these guys, Walther von der Vogelweide, was writing songs. And what we have passed down through the ages was the written down lyrics of the songs. It's not poetry. But we say that it's poetry because when we rediscovered, the Middle Ages in the 18th century and 19th century, we thought, well, this is great, literature. And we had a need to make it in this, interpret it in a way that we would interpret our life now as some kind of majestic, dignified art culture. And so we took song lyrics and made it into poetry. But it's not actually poetry. It's song lyrics. And it's different. I may be confusing you at this point because you may not understand what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about three things. First of all, happiness. Second, Silke Andrea Schuemmer. And third, Walther von der Vogelweide. Okay, happiness we'll get to. Silke Andrea Schuemmer is a poet, and she writes. She's a poet. She's a modern poet, and I think she's kind of like a romantic poet, frankly. When I look at her works, her poems, and they're very German in the sense that sometimes they're a little bit difficult to understand. You have to kind of unpack them. You have to read them twice, 3 times. I have to read them several times because I'm stupid. But it's and modern poetry is often written like that. It's written difficult to understand because it's like you're supposed to kind of decipher it in a way. And when you do, the thing is, when you do decipher it, it's pleasurable. I mean, there is a pleasure in that. So but it's not that difficult to understand. It's not like that. But she does play with language in a way that is not intuitive. And but what she does underneath this surface, this veneer of challenging grammar and playing with language in a way that you may not expect, is kind of a romantic notion about life. She looks at a field of sunflowers and describes the sunflowers as a metaphor for death and the hope of life. And it's really beautiful. And I love this poem. This one poem I'm talking about is called Spirits Number 3. Spirits 3. There's a cycle of poems about spirits. And this is number 3. And I translated it into English. And probably, I don't know if I translated it correctly, actually, or well. But anyway, I translated it into English and I spoke it into a video. And I published a video just today on TikTok, YouTube, and I think Instagram. So if you want to look at it, a poem by Silke Andrea Schuemmer. And if you like her poetry, buy the book. She has a book. She has a website. I'll try to put it in the description. But I really like her poetry, so that's what I did, and so I did that poem. But at the same time, I started looking around for other poems that I can do, and I've done a couple of poems by another friend of mine, and I looked for other poems, and I went back to the Middle Ages, which was really my first love of literature. And I went back to Walther von der Vogelweide, and I cracked open a book of his. I wonder if I have this book here. Is that book? I think it's right there. Hold on. There it is, right there. It's right there, baby. This is these books of medieval poetry. It's students. It's university books. They're not beautiful books, and so I took, where was it? I landed on, I think it was in this book it's a poem number 3. Jensen, blah blah blah, Verlegenheit. Herrgott, Gesegene mich vorsorgen. And that's the poem. And I looked at this poem, and it's a beautiful poem, and it rhymes, and it's in medieval German, and which is difficult for me to read. But still, when I read it, when I get it, I feel happy about getting what it's about. And so I took it and I translated it into English, and then I read it again in English, and I thought, oh my God, this is boring. It's a bad poem. He goes on and on. He meanders, and he goes on and on about this woman who has taken all his happiness from him, and he yearns for her to give back a little part of happiness to him. And if she would do that, if she could, when he sits in her presence, he is confused because she's so beautiful. And this is typical for Walther von der Vogelweide and for medieval poets in general. The medieval poets in general are always suffering. They're suffering because of some woman who is so beautiful that they get confused, and they, they give all of what they have and all of what they are just for one smile. And so she stoops to give them one smile, and they give her everything, and then they realize, I'm this is the wrong way to invest. If you're an investor, you don't give everything you have in order to get back a little fraction of that back. You do the opposite. You give a fraction of what you have in order to get something more back. But what he's saying, and I realize I'm reading this poem, reading my translation, and I realize it's not really a good poem. It probably was good when he was singing it and, entertaining people. It was, I can imagine, clearly because they loved him. So he was the premier German troubadour of his time. But as a poem, just reading it, it's not really good. So, but hidden within it, there was a metaphor about happiness. And I loved this metaphor. And the metaphor is the guy who is so, smitten by this woman, this beautiful woman, as men do. That's what we are. We are smitten by, it's the hormones. They screw us up. We see a beautiful woman and we just think she's a goddess, and she's just some girl. She's just like us. She's just some, going through puberty. She smells. She doesn't clean up her room. That's all she is. But we're in high school, and we see this girl and we're smitten, and she's a goddess, and she's every word from her mouth is poetry and wisdom and all. So he has this metaphor of he calls her almost like a thief, or he refers to her, doesn't use the word thief in the poem, but he refers to her as a thief. She steals his happiness. And so he prays to God to have more happiness, to give to her in order, because he thinks if he gives her more happiness, maybe she will be generous and give him back a little part of that happiness that he is spending on her. And so it's like this thing, you go one step forward and 2 steps back. Well, first you go 2 steps back. You go 2 steps back and 1 step forward. But he's saying, you go 10 steps back and 1 step forward. So that's what we do in life. That's what we're really, and I realized this week, which was it was a hard week. It was a hard week. It was dark and dreary. I got some work done, not as much as I wanted, but it was still, difficult. It was a slog, and there are weeks like this. And a lot of it was going 10 steps back in order to go 1 step forward. But the thing is, we need that step forward. We live for that 1 step forward. That 1 step forward is the 0.5% happiness, and the 10 steps back are the 10% unhappiness. But we can't get the 0.5% happiness without going the 10 steps back. 10 minus 10 10.0 happiness. And so we go back, we give our all, we suffer in order to get this little fragment of happiness. And that's what we do. And that's our entire lives. And I don't know, it's like, it's the Hamlet, it's to be or not to be, we suffer so much in life, and it's really so hard. And of course, I've never quantified it. I've never counted, units of suffering and units of happiness, but I'm kind of thinking the units of suffering are more. I'm kind of thinking it's more. I think these little glimpses of happiness that we have, sometimes it's we're so happy that we have it that we forget that we've suffered a lot to get it. It's like, summer. It's like winter and spring in Berlin. There are like winter in Berlin takes like how many months does a year have? 12 years, right? Winter in Berlin probably has about 11 and a half months, not years, 12 years, 12 months. So 12 months in a year, and of those 12 months, 11 and a half months are winter. And then you get 12 months, 2 weeks of spring, or 1 week of spring, 1 week of summer. And suddenly, and it's so great when suddenly it goes from this dark winter to this one brief, summer, one brief couple of weeks of spring. You're so happy that you forget that you've been suffering much longer than you will have happiness. Okay, so I'm babbling on because this is the second time I tried to record this video. The first time I didn't push a button. So I'm doing it again. So this is the second whiskey of this nature. And I'm babbling. But isn't life like this weird thing where you do take 10 steps backward in order to take one step forward, and you're so grateful for that one step forward that you are willing to take another 10 steps backward in order to just get this one step forward. Anyway, so that's the poem. What I did with this Walther von der Vogelweide poem is I translated it, and I realized, by today's standards, we underestimate what we've accomplished today. We look at our world and we say, Disneyland and Fox News and everything is so crap, and in the past everything was better. It was real literature, it was real culture and beauty. But what we do now is wrong and superficial and empty. But it's not true. It's the opposite. We have made incredible strides in culture. What we do now culturally is incredibly intelligent and advanced and virtuous, contains a huge amounts of virtuosity that back then they were just beginning. They were just inventing culture in the Middle Ages. You can't blame them for having something that was, compared to what we do today, simple. Walther von der Vogelweide, God bless his heart, I love his literature. I still love the first love of my life culturally is still the Middle Ages, and specifically the German Middle Ages. But you compare Walther von der Vogelweide with Bruce Springsteen, and Bruce Springsteen is better. He's really better. He says what he's trying to say, I mean, all this babble that I've been going on about, happiness, suffering, and then not killing ourselves because we want this little, quantum of happiness. He said it in a song. It was the song was "Reason to Believe." Is it where the dog beside the road hit by a truck, the owner of the dog pokes him with a stick, hopes that he's alive, and we all need a reason to believe to keep on living. That is a great song. Walther von der Vogelweide could not have written that song because his society wasn't there yet. And we just throw this off. We just think pop, Bruce Springsteen is just another pop singer. And of course he is just another pop singer. But it's great art. And Walther von der Vogelweide would have cried to hear this. He would have just realized that, it's just all his great art was just not enough. And it was great art. He was a great artist. He was a great songwriter, basically. Okay, well, so what I did was I took the song, and there was 3 verses in it, and it was too long and it meandered, and I reduced it all to one verse of maybe, I don't know, 8 lines, 10 lines, 12 lines, 15 lines, something like that. One verse, and I just reduced it to the metaphor of the beautiful thief who steals happiness, but who you give even more happiness in order to get one smile from her. And this is, I guess I've recorded it on a video, and I will put it, I guess I will publish it next Friday, a week from now, Friday, on, I guess, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. And, but since doing that, I thought about happiness and suffering. And this idea of suffering, going back 10 steps in one step forward, 10 steps of suffering, 1 step of happiness. That's all a romantic notion. But there was also sociology. There was a audiobook, a great courses, university course by Mark Dawson. I think I've missed his name now. I forget his name, but it was a course about sociology, and he talked about happiness and he said 60% of happiness, of whether we are happy or not, is determined by genetics and how we are raised. Social. What do you call it? I don't know how we're raised. Okay, so this is something we cannot influence. We basically have to live with it. 60%, and I'm genetically and per being raised, I'm basically an unhappy person. So 60%, I will always be unhappy, and I think that's basically true. My feeling is that it's true, but he said 40%, you can change yourself, and how you change happiness is how you gain happiness is basically you do things that make you intrinsically happy. Things that are intrinsically joyful are things that you do because you like doing them. Things that are extrinsically not joyful are things that you do in order to reach another goal. So we go to work, we type in, numbers in a keyboard all day, and then we go home, and we do that in order to be able to pay the rent, in order to live. So we don't do it because we like doing it. We do it for another purpose. But we go out and we play a game of soccer, or we take a walk, we go swimming, or we, have sex or go to a movie, because we like doing that. And that's intrinsically joyful thing. And 40%, we can influence this 40% of happiness by doing intrinsically joyful things. So that's where I got to from starting out with translating a poem by Walther von der Vogelweide. The last word of that poem is happy.